Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ana Reyes. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so pleased to introduce this virtual event with MICHAEL KAZIN, presenting his book, What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party. He is joined in conversation by Lizabeth Cohen. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Harvard Bookstore's virtual event series continues as our spring lineup flourishes, which allows us to present authors and their work to our incredible community, especially on this digital platform. Find our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and shop our shelves from the comfort of your home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will also have auto-generated closed captioning available. Depending on your version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. If you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, in a moment, I'll be posting a link in the chat for What It Took to Win available on our website. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of this landmark independent bookstore. Thank you all for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, and indie bookselling. We sincerely appreciate your support, especially now. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. MICHAEL KAZIN is a professor of history at Georgetown University and an editor emeritus of Dissent. His books include American Dreamers, How the Left Changed a Nation, The Populist Persuasion, and A Godly Hero, The Life of William Jennings Bryan. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and an editor of the Princeton Encyclopedia of American Political History. Joining him on our digital stage this evening is Lizabeth Cohen. She is the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies at Harvard University and the former dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She is the author of Making a New Deal, Industrial Workers in Chicago, 1919 to 1939, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and a winner of the Bancroft Prize. Tonight, they gather to discuss What It Took to Win, a history of the Democratic Party. Adam Hochschild, author of Rebel Cinderella, aptly described it as learning at last the full backstory of an elderly great uncle who has forever been at the dinner table. There are those unsavory episodes he never told us, the remarkable achievements we'd half forgotten about, and finally, the reminder that he is too large a presence to entirely love or hate, for the family absolutely cannot survive without him. And with that, we are so pleased to be celebrating this book tonight. The digital podium is yours, MICHAEL and Lizabeth.
Thank you very much, Anna. Are you going to disappear?
I am, y'all.
Okay. Very good. Well, welcome to everyone and to MICHAEL. It is a real pleasure for me to talk to you tonight about your wonderful new book. Let me just say to the audience that if they decide to read the book after our conversation, they are in for a treat. It is very well written. It gives us a long-term picture of the successes and the failures and the turning points in the history of the Democratic Party, which is the oldest mass political organization in US history. And I think, Mike, the book is really a very impressive feat of research, of synthesis, and of writing. So congratulations.
Thank you.
We have much we can talk about, but I'd like to just start with a more personal question. I'd like you to tell us what led you to write this book when you did. I have to say, I think your timing is impeccable. We have a Democratic president who just squeaked into office and every day faces challenges to his victory. And looking forward, we know the Democratic Party is facing some tough challenges in the midterm elections, with predictions of losing their very slim majorities in the House and the Senate, which will make it that much harder for President Biden to implement his agenda. So can you give us a backstory to this book?
Sure, and thanks again. I should say, full disclosure, we're old friends, and Professor Cohen is one of the greatest American historians alive. So it's both an honor and a pleasure to be discussing the book with her. And also, I went to Harvard long ago, and Harvard Bookstore was sort of a respite from the difficulties of being a student in the late 1960s. So I'm very glad it's still around, virtually or otherwise. I began to write the book, actually. I've been thinking about the Democratic Party for a long time. As I mentioned in the book, I've been canvassing for Democrats since I was 12 years old in a suburb of New York City, handing out leaflets for John F. Kennedy and wearing a huge button the size of a small pie on my jacket that I had to wear at the school I went to. But I've always been on the left side of the Democratic Party, and only several times have I not, considered myself to be a capital D Democrat. But I decided to write a book for a couple of reasons. One, Donald Trump was elected in 2016. People probably remember that. And it seemed like the Democratic Party was adrift. Why could Hillary Clinton have not gotten enough votes in those key states in the Midwest that Democrats sort of took for granted that they would win, at least for several elections before then. And also, I've been concerned that the Democrats were sort of drifting, not quite clear what their policies were. They couldn't really explain to a lot of Americans why they should vote for Democrats as opposed to just voting against Republicans. And I began to think about also, what happened in the past when Democrats were able to be successful, when they were the majority party, which didn't happen that often in American history. There have not been that many periods when one party has been dominant. The Jacksonian era was one of them, from the late 1820s up until the mid 1850s. The other time the Democrats was not till the New Deal period, from the 1930s till the New Deal order period, as historians call it. And one of Liz great books, Making a New Deal, is very much about the beginning of that period. But since then, the Democrats have won a lot of elections, lost a lot of elections. So basically, I wanted to find out, when they've done well, how they did it, and if there's any common elements there. Obviously, as an historian, we realize history does not really repeat itself, but there's certain common elements, I think. And also, I should say, another sort of scholarly or academic motivation was institutions really matter in any society. But very few historians, at least of late, really write about institutions. We write about social movements, we write about culture, we write about the lives of ordinary people in various ways, which is all very important. But we very seldom write about governmental or quasi-governmental institutions, like the Democratic Party always has been. So I also wanted to figure out what the imprint of that institution was in American life to a certain degree. And I should also say personally that my son, Danny, has been working for Democrats ever since he was in college, maybe 15 years ago, 14 years ago. And so learning about the Democratic Party from the inside for the various jobs he's had also motivated me to try to understand how the institution developed historically.
Thanks. That's very good. So what you make several compelling arguments in the book. And I'm going to just kind of run through what I think are sort of the major ones and ask you to kind of elaborate and suggest how helpful or crippling you think they've proved over time. So I'm just going to take them sort of one at a time.
Great.
First, one of your major arguments is actually something you borrowed from me, which is this notion of the Democratic Party long promoting a commitment to what I called moral capitalism in my book, and you are really expanding in your book. And in Making a New Deal, which was the book where I kind of coined this phrase, I was using it to try to understand the mindset of industrial workers in the 1930s when they joined, when they organized for the first time in the CIO as industrial workers in a very strong union movement, and also became real supporters of Franklin Roosevelt. So I wanted to try to find out their mindset. And what I argued was that even though they were in many cases inspired and mobilized by people who were very clearly socialists and particularly communists, they themselves often did not buy into that ideology. And that in fact, they really believed that capitalism could work for them so long as it was fair to everyone. And that's where I came up with this notion of moral capitalism. You've taken the concept and you have applied it to a much, much longer history of the Democratic Party, really back to Andrew Jackson. So I'd like to ask you to talk about that and why you see this sort of working as a through line for such a long period of time. Were there moments when it was more sort of successful than others? Were there ups and downs? Were there moments when it was quite contested within the party as well as from without? So I'd just like you to give us a sense of why you decided that this would be the way you would sort of explain the sort of longue durée of the Democratic Party's sort of ideological commitment.
Well, you said quite well that most workers, even when the left was very strong in the 1930s, both socialists and communists, most working people who were joining unions of the CIO did not want to do away with capitalism. They wanted a fair capitalism. They wanted a capitalism which would provide opportunity, which would compel the bosses to pay them better wages. And I think in many ways, Democrats have stood for a politics that will benefit ordinary people, an economy that benefit ordinary people without transforming the economy utterly. Without going away from market economy, without going away from the wage labor system. Really, ever since there was universal white manhood suffrage, which began to happen in the 1820s and the 1830s. And Jackson, for all the now historians would argue crimes that he committed, Native American removal and relocation, and of course defending slavery and defending the expansion of slavery. His constituency were ordinary white people in the whole country, and many large slave owners in the South as well. But I think the coalition was held together in many ways by a sense that the ordinary person should be able to make money, that the second bank in the United States, which was a government institution, which was really the most powerful financial institution in the country by far, it printed its own money. It decided to invest as a small group of directors in Philadelphia decided they wanted to invest. So it was very much a financial elite. And Jackson and Van Buren, his vice president, really a big party builder, really based a lot of their appeal on, you might say, give the ordinary guy a chance. Don't make decisions from the top on where the money's going to be invested. And for them, moral capitalism was also a capitalism where there would not be large tariffs on imported goods. So ordinary small farmers would be able to buy the tools they needed and eventually the machinery they needed without paying huge prices for it. And gradually that idea, that general ideal of moral capitalism, I think migrated to, by the 1890s, when William Jennings Bryan was the candidate for the party, and really, even though he didn't win election, though he ran 3 times, I think he did help transform the party into a party that believed that to help the ordinary person, the federal government had to get involved in regulatory institutions like the Federal Reserve System, in legislating an 8-hour day for railroad workers, which was the major group of most critical group of workers in society at the time. And then, of course, in the New Deal, then with the help, if you will, of the Great Depression, the Democratic Party under Franklin Roosevelt does create jobs for people, does create public power, the TVA. And without going all these details, I think in many ways the Democrats are still the party that in their aspirations anyway, that Franklin Roosevelt and other New Dealers created. They've had, back and forth debates since that time, of course, about what that might mean, who the ordinary people were. And of course, until the 1960s, for most Democrats, ordinary people were still mostly white, even though I think the CIO unions you wrote so wonderfully about in Making Your Deal began to make that change because they were interracial unions for the first time, really. But they connected, these interracial unions connected to the Democratic Party. And one of the themes I focus on is that the definition of moral capitalism, I think, begins in the 19th century as more of an anti-monopolistic, anti-money power, anti-financial elite kind of ideology, and some programs to match it. But by the 1890s, during this terrible depression of the 1890s, the greatest depression in America up to that point, it's beginning to change into a focus on wage earners, on people who work for somebody else, as opposed to small business people, small farmers against the large agricultural interests, the large financial interests, the large industries. Democrats never lose the anti-monopoly edge entirely, haven't lost it today. There's a lot of people like Senator Elizabeth Warren who continue to talk about antitrust in a more aggressive way. But I think the main programs that Joe Biden has been trying to get passed, if he could only get past the filibuster in the Senate, probably would get passed, I think are focused much more on wage earners and a sense of justice economically for them. So now, of course, Democrats have not always won election, even though they've talked about these ideals in different ways. But my argument in the book is that when Democrats, well, a heterogeneous coalition, it's always been, even though at first only heterogeneously white, but now heterogeneously immigrants, young people, old people, .com billionaires, academics like us, as well as a lot of ordinary working people, especially non-white working people. And when it's been organized around a more general sense of you might say, universal needs of the majority of the population, below those who are rich, a set of programs that are universal programs like Social Security, like Medicare, like the Wagner Act, which was supposed to help people form unions no matter who they were when they wanted to. It's done best, I think. And when the coalition is split up among its different interests and does not agree on a central economic or political economic message, it has trouble. I'm not arguing that it's always a bad thing to do that, because it was absolutely essential in the 1960s for the Democrats to finally break from their racist past and spearhead the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and the Open Housing Bill. But that also caused them problems, as we know, because they began to lose the white South at the time. And also, I think there was a backlash among a lot of white workers in the North about that as well. So that's a very quick and dirty summary of what I'm trying to argue.
Well, I wanted to, it's a perfect segue into what I wanted to raise as really a second argument that I see running through the book, which is that the Democrats have always been a kind of big tent party that has struggled to hold together kind of strange bedfellows, and they have benefited from that and they have suffered from it. And today, I mean, God, we certainly see a party that is kind of tearing itself apart on a daily basis between progressives and centrists and so forth. So I wanted to ask you, and you've answered this to some extent already, what it takes to hold a big tent like that together. You've suggested universalistic sort of policies being one answer. I specifically wondered what your reaction was to how helpful or not the McGovern reforms for delegate selection were. Just a kind of reminder to the audience that after the fiasco of the Chicago Convention in 1968, McGovern headed a commission which really changed very substantially the way delegates were selected to the convention. And really what we saw as a result were many more voices represented at the convention. You make the point that at some point in the book that, ironically, you argue it becomes harder to hold that big tent together and, keep that New Deal order in place when you've got all those voices promoting their own interests. So talk about both the benefits and the difficulties of being a big tent party.
Sure, that's a great question. Well, a former radical leader named Carl Oglesby said at one point, SDS leader back in the 1960s, he said, democracy is nothing if not dangerous. and democracy in that sense, has been dangerous for Democrats. And it's a real dilemma because coming out of the 1968 convention that some people in the audience might remember, I was actually there demonstrating against the Democrats at that point in Chicago. Democrats decided they might disagree about a lot of things, but they decided they did not want to have sort of a boss-run convention anymore. Hubert Humphrey won the nomination in 1968 without running in a single primary. And so they did open it up. And the positive side of that, of course, was that a lot more women, a lot more African Americans, Latinos and Latinas, Asian Americans got seats, also gay and lesbians openly were delegates in 1972 convention. At the same time, though, it obviously became more difficult to decide, what people are going to unite on. They were all against the war in Vietnam, but that was pretty much all they agreed on, they united on. And also the labor movement, which had a lot of clout in the nominating process before then. And the head of labor of the AFL-CIO back then was a guy named George Meany, who was very much for continuing the war in Vietnam, which George McGovern was not. So in other words, if you have a small set of bosses, or let's just say, leaders who can make decisions, who can choose delegates themselves, who can decide this guy or this guy, and back then no women were seriously considered, would be the best candidate, that can sometimes work well. But I think one of the things the 60s did, and both of us grew up in that period, is that it made it very hard to, I think, inspire people to take part in party politics if they felt that process was closed to them. So Democrats had no real option, I think. And of course, it was interesting, not coincidental, that George McGovern was the chair of that commission, and guess who becomes the candidate in 1972? Sounds a little like administered boss-ridden process, but it wasn't. I mean, he won enough delegate votes in this new process. But what it did also is it, in many ways, I think, separated the party as an institution from the presidential nominating process. Because basically anybody who wants to run after that, if they can raise the money, they can get the support in these primaries, can win. And now the Republicans adopted it too, by the way. And without that, Donald Trump would not have never been nominated, because the bosses of the Republican Party, Mitch McConnell, et cetera, would not have wanted him to be the candidate. So, again, it was important, I think, to open up the party system. It made it easier for people to take part and feel like their voices were being listened to, and they were able to participate. At the same time, it obviously caused them problems, because unlike the Republicans, as I said before, Democrats have always been a very heterogeneous party, I think. I mean, even when they were, a white-only party, in fact, they weren't officially so, but they were a party of, Irish immigrants from the famine generation, 1840s and 50s, who came over here, half starving, only the clothes on their back. Many went to Boston, of course, and some of the richest people in America, Southern planters. And also they were a party of a lot of intellectuals. I say in the book, the Democratic Party for a while was the party of, at the same time, of Walt Whitman and Jefferson Davis, not an odd couple, you might say, looking back on it. So, I think the opening up of the process in the 1970s was inevitable, I would argue, and a good thing. But at the same time, it made it more difficult for the Democrats to unite on not just a single candidate, but also a single program.
Interesting. And a good point about the Republicans, to some extent, having succumbed to some of the same pressures.
But I want to say just real quick, the Republicans have an easier time, though, because Republicans have become primarily the party of white Christians. I think.
Well, I want to get to the Republicans in a bit, if I could just put that off for a sec, because I really do think I want to talk more about them. But just to finish up the kind of main arguments that you make,
Sure.
a third one that I just wanted to highlight is that, the book does argue for continuities, the world capitalism being that thread that you follow, but you do identify some very striking shifts that take place in the party. And I just wanted to sort of call out two of them that I think are, really crucial. One is that, the party shifts from being in its attitudes towards government, from being a party that is that sort of believes in decentralization and the less government, the better to some extent. And that the role of the party should be to curb the excesses of government, which at that time would have been identified in the earlier period with economic elites, shifts from that to a very different approach, which we see sort of taking shape in the 1930s, of tying itself to the federal government and seeing that that the government can actually deliver many benefits to ordinary people and protect people from those economic elites. So that's one sort of major shift that I see you sort of developing. The other one is one you've referenced already, of moving from a party that, barely tolerated, even endorsed a white supremacist regime, to one that today is, supported by almost all African Americans, another enormous change. So I just thought you might want to say something about, you don't need to, these are enormous questions, you have to read the book, folks, to get the full story, but do you want to comment on the significance of those changes?
Sure. Well, actually talk about why they happened, I think,
Okay.
And they're both, and there's a common thread there. Many ways. I wrote about this some in an op-ed in the New York Times last Sunday, but I think Democrats don't do things on their own. Of course, they're part of a context. And in American politics, as a lot of folks out there know, the context often is social movements, which arise outside the parties and put pressure on the parties to change. And I think Democrats do begin to make that change towards becoming, what we now think of as a New Deal party, not in the 20th century, but the late 19th century. I wrote a biography about a guy who was key to that, a guy named William James Bryan, who has said, ran 3 times, Democratic nominee, lost all 3 times, of course. But he was responding when he called for support for labor unions, for example, when he called for a much more flexible money supply, when he called for a while for actually nationalizing the railroads. So he went back on that after he said it. But he said, basically, the government can do whatever it needs to do to help people. And he was pressured by the populist movement. He had a lot of supporters in that. He was pressured by monetary reformers who wanted a more flexible money supply to help people get out of debt. And he was pressured by also labor unions, which he was very supportive of at the time, who all believed that they needed help from the government. And this was during, especially the 1890s, during, as I said before, the worst depression in American history to that point. So whether he would have moved that way, Democrats would have moved that way without that, but in order to get votes in 1896 election and afterwards as well, they really had to be responsive to people out there in the South, in the Plain States where Bryan was from, in parts of the Midwestern cities as well, where they needed to win the presidency and to win governorships and senatorial races, who were in effect saying, we can't help ourselves right now. We need the government to step in and help us to make a more moral capitalism. And they never really turned their backs on that. I mean, there were obviously conservatives in the party who thought it was a mistake to want a more aggressive federal government, but they never really went back on that. The other side, when the Democrats stopped being the racist party, is I think a story that you tell in some ways in your wonderful book, Making a New Deal. A lot of it has to do, first of all, I think with the Great Depression and Democrats under Franklin Roosevelt realizing that it wouldn't do just to help white people in these programs, because Black people are hurting very badly. Actually, some more Black people have voted for Democrats in 1928 in that election than they had in the history of Black people having the vote, and that was a lot because of prohibition and opposing that kind of coercive measure. But the programs in the 1930s, even though the Democrats were still very much a party of the white South, that was the most important part of it, were did believe in giving jobs to all groups as much as they could, and even though they're often segregated jobs, relief was not just for white people, but also, again, a movement was crucial here, which was the movement of the industrial unions of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which many people in the audience know broke away from the parent organization, the AFL, in 1935, and began to organize unions and get unions recognized by employers in the steel industry, the electrical industry, General Electric and Westinghouse, and various other industries as well, longshore industry on the West Coast. And these were interracial unions, and partly because there were radicals actually who helped organize these unions, who were anti-racist already. But the unions, people who ran those unions, soon realized that they weren't going to get anywhere unless they connected with big government. And part of what was happening also was the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act, was passed in 1935 by this overwhelmingly Democratic Congress to make it easier for workers to join unions. So there was a marriage, not always a happy marriage, but nevertheless a marriage between this rising movement of organized wage earners and the Democratic Party. And that, I think, began actually the process of losing the white South, even though many historians argue that, well, that really didn't happen until 1948 convention, when they stood out, when the Democrats adopted the Civil Rights Plank, or not until 1960s, when they supported Civil Rights Bill. I think it really begins to happen in the late 1930s.
So I would just add that a little bit more self-interest to the CIO's effort to include African Americans in the union, which was that they had a very clear memory of 1919 and the strikes, and they knew that employers would use African Americans as strike breakers if they didn't actually put out that bigger tent. So just wanted to add that.
That's definitely true. That's definitely true.
To turn now to the Republican Party, which you made some reference to, and you suggested that the Republicans were sort of more homogeneous, so they didn't have this. They don't today even have the same. You're suggesting big tent problems, but I just want to kind of ask you to think a little bit more about that. In that, in some ways, the Republican Party today resembles the Democratic Party of the 1930s in that it has, kind of white working class Americans. It has the South. It's, what once was a solid Democratic South is a pretty solid Republican South with few, perhaps, changes underway, Georgia, Arizona, hopes for Texas, and also a party that seems to be attracting recent immigrants. In the 1930s, it would have been Eastern and Southern Europeans. Today, it's Latinx populations, which we see surprisingly for many Democrats kind of moving into the Republican column. And also, I want to really, I'd like you to know your reaction about whether the finance class is still identified as Republican, which would make this, again, kind of strange bedfellows. And I raised that because I had sort of assumed that, that in the face of Trump, that, kind of Wall Street basically was kind of split, but that there were quite many sort of more progressive Democrats there, kind of moving towards voting Democratic and sort of not sticking with the Republican Party. But several months ago, I reviewed a book for the Washington Post, Evan Osnos's Wildland, The Making of America's Fury. And he looks at Greenwich, Connecticut, and identifies an area where he what he calls the Golden Triangle, which basically are very wealthy, powerful Republicans who kind of speak for the finance class. And to his astonishment and mine, and I could say I was rather appalled, he finds that Trump gets more votes in 2020 from that group than he did in 2016. That he went from getting 2% by winning by 2% in 2016 to winning by 13% in 2020. Now, these aren't obviously large numbers, but it does suggest that there is a big tent issue for the Republicans. And so, what do you make of that? And how do you think they manage to keep the kind of discipline that they do, or at least keeping this from sort of spilling out in the way we see it in the Democratic Party?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think obviously the Republicans began to attract more white working class people first when the Democrats became identified as the party of civil rights and a party that was perceived, rightly or wrongly, as a party that wanted to help Black people more than ordinary white people. And issues like affirmative action and busing in the 1970s, of course, were important to that. Also, the idea that college kids like me were protesting the war, whereas kids who didn't go to college had to go and fight the war. The cultural issue from the 60s has never quite gone away, even though it's been more than 50 years since that point. I do think, though, that that coalition is more united right now by what it's against than what it's for.
Good point.
And the only thing it's united about what it's for, you could say, are some cultural issues like pro-life, and opposition to immigration, and more recently, opposition to forcing little kids to learn about slavery or something like that, whatever you define it as. And whereas the Democrats are, for all their problems, and they have many, of course, do, I think, have a general sense, and the bills that Biden has been proposing, and have not unfortunately passed yet, are very positive bills. They're about positive liberty, as Isaiah Berlin called it. They're about a state, as we talked about, that would help ordinary people. So I think the Republicans are able to stay united because they have the same, they hate the same people, I think is one way to put it. Liberals, progressives, who are more and more powerful in the Democratic Party, and that's certainly true, than they were, say, in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was the face of the Democratic Party, are saying some things that are disruptive to people of a conservative mindset, no matter what class they're from, whether they're hedge fund managers from Greenwich, Connecticut, or former coal miners from West Virginia. And that's very powerful, source of motivation, I think. I do think, though, that that's an unstable coalition. If, again, a big if Democrats were able to, again, pass some of these programs and also be much better at presenting to people what they're really for. And I must say, if there are movements, large movements, backing up those ideas. And it's been said many times by many people, on the progressive, among progressives, but the lack of a strong labor movement that undergirded the Democrats' rise to being the dominant party in the 30s and 40s is really a huge disability for Democrats, because again, Republicans do have a movement. It's evangelical Christian churches, which have certainly as many members as more members than organized labor does today. They're not really growing, they're not getting young people, but they're still very powerful institutions. And again, institutions like that, which can explain the stakes of politics to people, which can get people out to vote, which can raise money surreptitiously for the churches, but nevertheless can raise money for people, for politicians who they support, is really critical, I think. And the Democrats don't really have that right now. They have little movements, different movements, LGBTQ, Black Lives Matter, pro-choice, pro-immigration rights, and so forth. But that's not what they actually need, I think, to again be a dominant majority party again.
And we shouldn't forget, I think, that the Republican Party delivers for those Wall Streeters with tax cuts. That they're not a lot. I don't think there are a lot of evangelical Christians in Greenwich, but they're getting other benefits, from the
And
party.
also, I mean, despite all the talk about, working class moving to, or Latinx people moving to the Republican Party, which, by the way, was about 10% change, not wholesale change. Still 2/3 of Latino voters voted Democratic in 2020. But still, according to exit polls at least, and some other polls, still Americans earning over $100,000 a year still voted much more Republican than Americans earning under $100,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
So that, very crude economic division is still holds. And that's been true, throughout the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you just a couple more questions, then we'll open things up. I've got lots of questions.
Looks like it's four people in the Q&A. So
yeah, okay. Well, I see we have questions, but I want to ask you about a couple other things. One is that this book has lots in it. One thing I didn't see you talk a lot about that we hear about in the discourse all the time is the impact of media on politics. You do talk about the sort of politically aligned newspapers of the 19th century and the role that they played in popular politics. But when it gets to the sort of issues that we're surrounded with today, and the impact of social media and Fox News and MSNBC, you really don't spend a lot of time on that. You mentioned Roger Ailes and Fox News at one point, but I wondered if you wanted to just reflect on whether you think that we've made too much of that, or whether you have something that you would still want to say.
No, sure. And no, it's true. I talked about radio in the 30s with FDR, and I talked about television. Adlai Stevenson thinking that television was a passing fancy. Nobody would ever want to advertise about politics on television. What an awful idea. But he was a fool in many ways. But anyway, yeah, well, I mean, part of what's happened, I think, and of course we could talk forever. We don't have forever to talk about the influence of the internet on politics. But of course, we're using it at the moment. But I think what's important, is that a lot of people out there who vote Republican do get their politics from Fox News, and as opposed to getting it as people used to get it from a party press, of course, but also from talking to their neighbors, to their friends, to their workmates, there used to be clubs, party clubs, Democrats and Republicans both had those clubs. You could sort of stop by. I don't want to romanticize them. They were, places where, people sometimes, got bribes and so forth. And sometimes guys just got drunk, but politics really was more localized, and not just politics was more localized, but how people learn about politics was more localized, and that's much less true now. Despite the fact we all have, almost everybody has, can use the internet anywhere they want to. I think there's a lot more, I should say, top-down politicizing, and people just thinking that if they spend 2-3 hours on Twitter, they'll go to all the political information they really need. And that's a problem. Again, institutions matter, and people, I think, trust people more if they know them. And part of the rise of Donald Trump, of course, is, look, where do people learn to know Donald Trump? Of course, on television, and they learn to trust him on television. And he didn't have to run for any other office besides president, because they already felt he came into their home. He maybe was an intimate friend, but he's an intimate personality anyway. And that's something which is pretty new. That's not something that would have been true any other time in American history.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one final question, then we're going to go to the audience. And that is, if you were asked to be an advisor to the Democratic Party for the 2024 presidential election, what would you tell them? What do you who should be the candidate, and what should be the message?
Well, first of all, I tell them they should buy a copy of my book and give it to everybody canvassing for the Democratic Party, and then I will give them the money from that. Get right back to them. I don't know. I mean, Joe Biden has problems. He's not a very effective communicator. Especially after Donald Trump, who obviously I share nothing with politically, but he was pretty damn good and is still pretty damn good at letting people know where he stands and what he thinks. Biden's been trying to be president for 30 years. He finally got there. And, if you were 10 years younger, I think he'd be more effective. That's pretty obvious. But again, who will be the better candidate? I don't know. My favorite candidate for a while has been this senator from Ohio, Sherrod Brown, who talks about the dignity of work. He wins in Ohio, which will become more and more of a red state. But he'll probably win again in 2024 if he doesn't run for president. Because Brown we need a candidate who can talk to working people of all races and immigrants and non-immigrants alike about common themes that will unite them. At the same time, we need a candidate as a Democrat who can talk about racial justice, who can talk about supporting transgendered people and so forth, because all those issues matter to Democrats. So that's not easy to do, as I mentioned. If it was easy to do, Democrats would be doing it better. But there are a few candidates who can do that without appearing to be very far left. He doesn't call himself a socialist. I respect socialism. I edited a socialist magazine for 12 years, Dissent magazine, but I don't think a socialist can be elected president, at least not right now. But you can support a lot of very progressive ideas that socialist parties in Europe would support, as Sherrod Brown does. And I think win in a state like Ohio, which if Democrats were able to win Ohio, they would be able to win in 2024, most likely.
Well, a big subject, and I'm going to turn things over now to the public. And let's see. First question, Michael, what surprised you the most while researching and writing this book?
Oh, great. Well, actually, I have a chapter, as Liz knows, about women in the party in the 1920s and early 30s. And to be honest, I didn't know very much about women in the party. I knew that the Democrats were less friendly to women than Republicans were. They took a longer time to support women's suffrage than Republicans did, for example. But I began to research women in a group called the Women's National Democratic Clubs, a group I never heard about before. And I found that all these reformers, many of them have been Republicans or Teddy Roosevelt progressives before this, like Belle Moskowitz, like Frances Perkins. Someone like Eleanor Roosevelt herself was never anything but a Democrat, but she wasn't very active. In the 1920s, they really embrace programs to help working people to deal with accidents that people had on the job, to deal with farm support and so forth, that become important in the New Deal as well. And they have a women's network they put together. And in fact, one of the things I found out, which is sort of kind of gallows humor, if you will, after the 1924 election, which Democrats got creamed in, their candidate won less than 30% of the vote, popular vote, if you can imagine that, because there's three major candidates in the race. Democrats didn't even have enough money to afford their own headquarters. So where did they put their desks? Where did they put their typewriters? Where did they put their file cabinets? In the headquarters of the Women's National Democratic Club, which was funded by some wealthy women, which did have a building they could buy. So without women in the Democratic Party in the 1920s, the Democrats would not have had any place to put their hats. That changed in 1928 because the Democrats had a very rich guy, General Motors and DuPont executive, who helped to fund them, became Democratic national chairman. But it surprised me. I didn't realize that at the time, especially when male Democrats who ran the party, had messed up so badly, there was women in some ways who saved the party organizationally. And also they became supporters of Al Smith in 1928, who is pretty much forgotten today, but he was a kind of transformative candidate in many ways, because he did support a lot of programs that became New Deal programs. And by the way, Al Smith, this candidate that women in the party supported very, very strongly, was the first candidate that I've read about who was baited as a socialist by the Republicans. Herbert Hoover, who won that election in 28, said that he was following socialist policies like supporting a minimum wage.
So just to follow up on this gender question before we go to the next one, what about today? I mean, there's so much obsession with the male voter and the sort of masculinity being expressed in the ballot at the polling place. And, we pay a lot of attention to men. What about women today? And how does the Democratic Party do with women?
Well, there's still a gender gap, but white working class women voted for Trump, not as heavily as white working class men did, but they still did. by like 55%, I think, something like that, 10% less than what working class men. And look, what working class women, need family support, need higher wages. I think also working class women could use unions as well. A lot of the programs are talking about childcare and so forth. So again, it's a failure of the party right now that a lot of those people probably don't even know some of these programs. I mean, if you ask people, out in Nebraska, working class women who work in a meatpacking plant, let's say, and or in an office, who vote Republican pretty much down the line, did you know the Democratic Party wants to give you money to support childcare for your little kids? I think hardly any of them would know that, and that's a failure. That's a failure of the party in Nebraska as well as elsewhere. I do think that the issues we think about as women's issues do tend to be much more issues like abortion, or like abortion, especially abortion, which of course we'll see what the Supreme Court does with the Mississippi case. But if they throw it out, then maybe that'll become a major issue. But I think, and again, polls I think show this, that far fewer people than we think, far fewer women than we think, vote on that issue. And the ones who do, at least traditionally, for the last few decades, have much more been women on the pro-life side as opposed to women on the pro-choice side. Now, maybe that will change if Roe v. Wade is overturned. We'll have to see. Democrats still have more leaders who are women. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, right, obviously, but and of course Kamala Harris. But that itself is not enough, clearly. Well,
a related question that an audience member has asked is, can you talk about the seeming tendency for people to vote their values rather than their interests? One could even add to that economic interests. And you made that point about the female meatpacking worker, but in general, it's a really significant issue.
Sure. I mean, I think values that are very essential to people come from their religion, come from their sense of morality, are interests too. I think we shouldn't oppose economic interests to other kinds of interests or the kinds of sentiments that are very important to people. And America's always been a very religious country, probably less religious than we have been traditionally, historically, but still, people who take their religion seriously are going to vote often on that basis, regardless of whether the people they're voting for are supporting their economic interests or not. But I think for Democrats to be successful, they have to find ways to, again, say, we respect you for the position you have, and might be controversial, to say that I think if you're pro-life, I think Democrats should say, look, that's not our position. We're not going to support that position, but we're not going to read you out of the party if you come in. I mean, there's a senator that the Democrats need, Bob Casey from Pennsylvania, who's pro-life, and there's some Congress people as well who are pro-life. So I think again, Democrats can talk about a lot of things, but they have to have a common position, common themes, which can unite as many of the people in the party as possible. And I think traditionally those have always been economic themes. And economics can be a value too, after all. I mean, if you believe that the very rich should pay a lot more taxes than they do, have too much power in politics, which they do, that's also a value, that's also a sense of morality, I believe. And when Sherrod Brown talks about the dignity of labor, that's a value too, which is, I think, when people work 2 or 3 jobs and can barely make enough to keep their families fed and housed, that's also a value.
I think that you also, in speaking to the importance of religion, it does also that does reinforce your point about the power of institutions, and that when you look around and see what institutions are viable today, still, churches for many Americans are really it. So. And they have really spilled over into many arenas of life in their
And the problem is, again, polls show that if you go to church or any religious institution once a week, you're much more likely to vote Republican than if you don't. Mm-hmm. I mean, across class lines, not across racial lines, because Black people go to church still vote overwhelmingly Democratic. But that's not true for Latinx people, especially those who are Protestant as opposed to Catholic. So.
Now we have a real historical question here about how much credit you would give to Martin Van Buren for the formation of the Democratic Party.
The Little Magician from Old Kinderhook, New York. A lot, I think. He really is known as, and I think rightfully so, as the main architect of the party. It's he who put together in the 1820s, small business, white working class people from New York State, especially, which was the largest state in population at the time, which he was from, with those who called themselves the old Jeffersonians from Virginia, some other parts of the South too, who were for the most part, slave owners, not all. And also he encouraged Democratic parties in lots of states, cities to start their own presses, to start their own media, as we now call it, to begin to have local organizations to turn out the vote. And also, in a grudging way, but finally he also supported the idea of competitive parties, that the Democrats, it was a good thing to have competitive parties. And that was very new, actually, in American life, and you might argue in the life of the world, really, in other republics too. And that's something which, unfortunately, Donald Trump's Republican Party was throwing into question by questioning the results of the last election. So don't know if we have more time.
We have two more questions, and I think we can get through them both so everybody gets heard. The first, is there anything that you would change about the book now? Anything you wish that you had added in or taken out? Because we know it went to press, 9 months ago, a year ago.
Yeah. Well, I was more sanguine about the possibilities of, I hedged my bets. I said it would depend on the 2022 midterms if Joe Biden would be successful, because, historically, it's really important to realize that the first midterm after the presidency changes hands is crucial to decide the results of that, decide everything else. If the Democrats had not picked up seats in 1934, after FDR was elected in 1932, they would not have been able to probably to pass a lot of their New Deal programs. And that's the only time in the 20th century or 21st century that Democrats have picked up seats in the midterm election after they took back the White House. So auguries aren't good. Other than that, there's a lot of things I wish I put in, but I don't like to write books that I want people to read the whole book. And there's some historians, as you know, who write 800-page books. And I want people to read the whole thing. So, probably 2 years from now, I'll regret some things I didn't put in there. But right now, I can't think of anything big.
And then the last question is a counterfactual that historians don't always feel comfortable with, but let's ask it anyway. You've touched on the New Deal and the Great Depression being a major turning point for the Democratic Party, becoming more pro-government, and person is asserting that. What if can be a dangerous game, but how would you see the party changing during the 20th century without that pivotal moment? Without a Great Depression, would the party have moved in the directions it did?
Well, of course, without the Great Depression, the world looks different too. Right. Maybe Adolf Hitler applies to art school again. Maybe you can get him this time. Fascism does not probably gain in Europe as it did in the 30s. So many things will change because the Great Depression was not just an American thing. But as one of our both former mentors, David Brody, used to argue, what was called welfare capitalism was doing pretty well in the 1920s. Profit sharing and government and employer-controlled unions and so forth. So without the Great Depression, I think the Republicans stay in power for a while longer. People forget it wasn't just that Roosevelt winning in 1932, which began a New Deal era. It ended a period of roughly 40 years in which the Republican Party was a majority party. Not in every election, but unless the Republican Party split, as it did in 1912, with Theodore Roosevelt running against the incumbent William Howard Taft, which allowed Woodrow Wilson to squeak in, Republicans were the majority party. The Republicans, for the most part, set the tune of American politics. And that could have continued because they were the party of big business. And, as Calvin Coolidge, that famous president in 1920 said, the business of America is business. And it could have remained just business and not moral business at that.
I guess we should be happy there was a Great Depression then.
Well, no, not exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike. This was really great.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks to everybody who braved the snows of the internet to come out and and watch it. And thanks very much, Anna, for your help there.
Yeah, thank you so much again to Michael and Lizabeth for this meaningful conversation. And thank you to everyone for spending your evening with us. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Mass, keep reading, stay safe, and be well. Have a lovely rest of your week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Deb.
bye-bye.